Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crazy Good Turns, the podcast that recognizes and celebrates people who do great things for others. I'm your host, Frank Blake, and today's show is a bit of an experiment with our usual format. First, some background. Since we launched Crazy Good Turns, I've benefited from the advice and counsel and inspiration of many different people. And at the top of that list is my friend Larry Powell, who is sort of a walking crazy good turn himself. Among other things, Larry is always encouraging me to make Crazy Good Turns a better and better version of itself. For example, we've frequently done $50 giveaways where we'll send a $50 gift card to listeners with the only request that in turn they give the $50 to someone whom they want to recognize and thank. This idea was inspired by Larry and how he lives his own life. As a side note, it's caused me every Thanksgiving to eat a Thanksgiving breakfast at Waffle House and leave a $50 tip. Because Larry is such a great source of help and guidance for the podcast and for me, I asked him whether he had anyone that he thought should be featured as a guest on the show. And I also asked him if he'd pitch in and help. So this show is a result of that. Today's episode is about a family that Larry very much admires. We're going to be speaking with Luther and Jane Lockwood. Jane is Luther's daughter, and when she was just 5 years old, she was diagnosed with a rare form of muscular dystrophy. From that day forward, Luther and the rest of their family have been extraordinarily dedicated to finding a cure for Jane and for the thousands of others who are facing her condition. The family launched the McColl-Lockwood Laboratory for Muscular Dystrophy, a respected and innovative research laboratory, and they searched the world over to find some of the foremost experts studying the condition. And through decades of dedication, their laboratory has developed some exciting potential treatments for the disease. During today's show, you'll hear from both Luther and Jane and get to know some of their thoughts and things that they've had to overcome. But we're going to start with some thoughts from Larry. And I want to start first, Larry, by thanking you for all the help you've given for Crazy Good Turns over time. And then ask what led you to suggest that we feature Luther and Jane's story on Crazy Good Turns?
First of all, I thought it was a beautiful story of a father's love for his daughter. I thought it was also a wonderful intersection of stewardship of both influence and affluence. I thought it was an amazing story of persistence because he's been doing this for 20 plus years. And then I also thought about the courage it would take for a guy. And Luther, you can correct me on this, but as far as I knew, his background was all a business background, not a science background. And to step into the world of biopharma had to take, in my opinion, a lot of courage and frankly, a lot of faith too. And it was applied faith. It wasn't just being a believer. It was being a doer.
Larry, that's a terrific summary. Thank you. And Luther, first, thank you for joining the podcast. And maybe a good place to start our conversation is with your telling our listeners how you first learned of Jane's condition.
When she was about 5 years old, her teacher noticed that she didn't get around the playground the same way her peers did. So she suggested that we take her to a doctor. Once she was diagnosed, my wife and I are like, my gosh, what are we going to do? It's a fairly rare disease. There are only about 7,000 people, we think worldwide that have been diagnosed with this.
That had to be overwhelming and scary. I want to bring in Jane now. And Jane, thank you for joining the podcast. What do you remember about this time period?
So I was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy when I was 5. I didn't really know what was happening.
Right.
I just knew I was going to the doctor a lot. I remember the gloves that the doctors always wear. I just distinctly remember my dad would always blow those up into little balloons. I don't remember much from that time. I guess just growing up, I was always aware that my parents were very dedicated to finding a cure for this disease for me and for other people.
Once she was diagnosed, my father-in-law, Hugh McColl, was on the board of the hospital at that point. And so someone at the hospital came forward and said, hey, would you have any interest in funding research to try to come up with a cure for the disease? We had a meeting. It was Hugh and my wife and I went and met with the people at the hospital foundation. Jeffrey Rosenfeld was our physician who diagnosed her, and he said we should study this and try to come up with something to try to help her and thousands of other patients like her.
Luther, when in that Bulldog Illustrated interview I read over the weekend, the quote for you to live by, it's Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is expected. How's that motivated you in this whole process, Luther?
Well, that's something Hugh says a lot. He was told that when he was a kid. My wife's family really believes in that, and I really believe in it as well. I said when we started the company, if I can help my daughter, we're going to help thousands of other people at the same time. And if we can be a role model for others in that process, so be it.
Thank you, Luther. Jane, as you were growing up with this condition, what was it like? How did it impact you? How did other kids treat you? And did they treat you differently?
The teachers obviously always knew when I was going into school. And in second grade, my mom said that the kids were starting to ask more questions, like, why doesn't Jane have to do PE? Like, that's not fair. The teacher came to my mom and said, this would be a good time for Jane or you guys to tell the other kids, because in second grade, the teacher said being different is cool. And then once you get to third grade, being different is weird. And so she kind of convinced my parents and we're like, hey, this is like the right time to tell everybody. So my parents would write me a letter and I would bring it to my PE class each year, starting in second grade. And I would read the letter and it would just explain what limb-girdle muscular dystrophy is at a baseline level for that age group.
How did things change as time went on? Did the condition worsen?
I would say when she was a teenager, she was mature beyond her years because she would realize that, hey, I can't put myself in a social situation or a situation where I could end up in a bad spot.
So I definitely feel like there were moments when I was a teenager where it affected me more. Just, being a teenager, things are already hard. And
that's already pretty fraught. Yeah.
Right. You add on an incurable diagnosis that you don't know what's going to happen. When are you going to be in a wheelchair? Like, what's your life going to look like? So that I feel like being a teenager, that was probably the hardest moment. But other than that, I try not to think about it. It started progressing more in college, and then during COVID, more rapidly progressed. I now use a walker inside my house and a wheelchair outside of the house just to make sure that I don't fall and get hurt, because that's just would not be good. The recovery would cause further deterioration.
As Jane was living with this disease, Luther and her family worked to get their research laboratory off the ground. Luther, tell us about the McColl-Lockwood lab and how it's progressed over time.
We started it on a confidential basis. And then I guess once our daughter got to the point where the teacher would read the letter to her classmates, we're like, well, this is pretty obvious. She has some issues and we should go ahead. And the people at the Atrium Foundation said we could really raise additional money if your family would let us use your name around this. And so that's when we agreed to kind of go a little more public with it. So, and that attracted some scientific talent, and we're grateful Dr. Key Liu has been our chief medical investigator really from inception.
And Luther, in 2003, you were, if I do the math right, you were in your mid-30s. You and your wife had, along the way, a total of 3 kids, right? And so you're trying to build your business. You're trying to be a good dad and husband to all 3 of your kids. And my sense is that you put a lot of, not just your name on this, but a lot of time and energy in getting this thing off the ground. How do you go about recruiting the human talent to make something like this a reality, the quality of researchers that it takes?
Well, that's a great question. We were fortunate that Dr. Rosenfeld, we did a global search, and we actually recruited Dr. Liu from a research facility in London.
Wow.
He is of Chinese descent. he went to the University of Shanghai Medical School. And if you do the math, based on the Chinese population, the Shanghai Medical School is like the Harvard of the country. And so the chances of getting an education from Shanghai Medical School is less than 1 in a million. So it's literally the very smartest people in the country. And at one point, I think we had 3 other researchers from the University of Shanghai, and Chinese was the predominant language in the laboratory. So I had zero scientifically. I've learned a lot through this process from Dr. Liu and the rest of the team. And we have been fortunate that he has come up with multiple breakthroughs from a scientific standpoint in the 20 years that he's been at the McColl-Lockwood lab.
And then from the laboratory work, Luther, y'all started the McColl-Lockwood Biosolutions. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, ML Biosolutions is the name of it. And it was basically the company was to develop technologies that evolved from the McColl-Lockwood lab.
So you were able to attract very smart people. What did they learn about limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and how to treat the disease?
I guess about 6 to 7 years ago, the team actually came up with 2 breakthroughs. The first, we had a gene therapy. And at that point, we were very fortunate. We had another, researcher, Dr. George McClendon, actually kind of was the head of all research at Atrium Health. And so Dr. Liu in our lab rolled up to him. He recognized some of the IP that was being developed. He took, our first idea, which was the gene therapy research, and some of the IP was jointly held with the University of North Carolina Medical System because we had funded research there as well. And Dr. McClendon actually quit his job at the hospital system and took an 80% pay cut to come help me start the company. We licensed 6 patents from the hospital, and then Dr. McClendon and I kind of hit the road, and we had several interested investors to fund a clinical trial.
Luther, where is ML Biosolutions in terms of the FDA process now?
Basically, we're in phase 3, which is the last phase. This is a pivotal trial. And so the way the trial worked, we started off kind of phase 0-1, where we gave the drug to healthy patients. And it's, to be honest, mostly college students that we pay to just make sure the drug's safe. We're not trying to check if it's effective in fighting the disease or not. And we've published research that says that, yes, the patients in phase 2 did improve, once they started taking the drug. And so she's been a beneficiary of that. And, there's some kind of quality of life things that have actually helped her quite a bit. Some simple things you wouldn't think about, that now she can hold her arm up higher to put on deodorant than she could before because she has weakness in her shoulders. Or she can hold a hairdryer to dry her hair. So some things like that we just don't even think about that are kind of challenging for her to do.
By the time you get finished with the phase 3 trials, even with the expedited review process, you will have spent close to 25 years of your life with this. Can you just sort of walk us all through the time, the energy, the ups, the downs, lessons learned, all those as you reflect back on this process, Luther?
We're not across the goal line, but I would say I've had a number of people make comments through the years to say that, the chances of your family bringing this to where we are has got to be less than 1 in a million. To have a daughter who's diagnosed pretty quickly. I mean, I've heard stories that it takes, it's taken people 10 or 15 years to figure out exactly what was wrong with them, to having the means and the relationships and the resources to fund a research lab, and then have the research come up with not 1, but 2 potential, not necessarily cures, but treatments for the disease. We're very fortunate to have gotten as far as we have. And that's why I say jokingly, we're a 20-year overnight success, that we've been at this a long time to get to this point. And my wife, Jane, has played a big role in that part of our kind of family mission to try to help others who are dealing with this disease, whether it's the individuals or their family members that are working through this. Her primary role today is she's the caregiver for our daughter. Our daughter now is 27, She's getting ready to enter law school, which we're excited about. It's been her lifelong dream to be a lawyer. She didn't think from a stamina standpoint she could actually go to law school after she graduated from undergrad, because one of her coping mechanisms as she's gotten weaker, and she went to Wofford College, she chose to go to a small school where she could physically get around the campus once she got out of high school. But, as kind of COVID hit, she started to decline fairly significantly, and she's in a wheelchair most of the time now. Anytime she leaves the house, she has a motorized wheelchair that helps her get around. So one of her coping mechanisms, since the actual how the disease works, her muscles are weaker and they're not going to necessarily get a lot stronger. For a healthy person, we eat and rest, and our muscles regenerate after we exercise. And so she has, I guess, the simple way to explain it, there's an enzyme that her body doesn't produce the way normal people produce. And so she has a protein called FKRP that she does not metabolize properly. So the team at the research lab cloned a mouse that has exactly the same muscle mutation that our daughter has. They learned from a group of researchers in Japan that was doing some other studies that, hey, this might be a way, if we give the mice this catalyst, maybe they could metabolize the protein. And so we did that with the mice, and the mice got stronger. So that was our preclinical data to say, hey, it worked in the mice. Mice aren't people. You still have to prove it to people and make sure it's safe and that type of thing. But that was our preclinical data. But back to her coping mechanisms, if she eats, it doesn't help re-nourish her. She sleeps a lot more than most people do. She's asleep, I'd say, or laying in bed probably 12 to 14 hours a day. And that's really not very conducive with first-year law school.
Jane, how does it feel to be a graduate student now?
I'm very excited so far. It hasn't quite sunk in that it's all happening yet.
Why, out of curiosity, did you choose to go to law school?
In 8th grade, for our civics class, we had a judge come into our class, and we conducted a mini mock trial, and I got to be one of the attorneys. I can't remember which side I was on,
right.
But I just kind of fell in love with that. And then we did something similar in college in constitutional law, and I loved it then too.
And how does it feel to be helping others who are affected by your condition?
I don't know if I've necessarily done a ton to help. I feel like it's more my parents that have been driving this. As I've gotten older, I've definitely been more involved, but it's definitely all because of them that we are where we are today, in terms of, having a lab dedicated to this and having a company that has successfully started a clinical trial. So I'm just very grateful for them and all the hard work that they've put into this. I truly owe just everything to them and to my family for dedicating their lives to this.
Now, for every show, I always ask our guests about someone who's done a crazy good turn for them. So I'll start with you. Larry, who would you signal as having done a crazy good turn for you?
When I was in 10th grade in high school, Frank, I had an English teacher named Juline Jones, and she was getting close to retirement. But I turned in a paper and sort of halfway put any effort into it. And she, at the top of it, she wrote, "Mr. Powell, you are better than this." And then we talked about that. And so that's almost 60 years ago. I remember her helping me understand that I could be more than I thought I could be. And maybe she spent an hour or something, or even less, but just the encouragement and her sort of expanding my parameters and my paradigm, I carried with me the rest of my life. So that was truly a crazy good turn.
That's a great example. That's a great example. I get a lot of answers that go back to a teacher. I tell them to my daughter, who's a teacher. So I think there's reassurance for all the teachers out there.
Yep.
Lister, how about yourself?
I would go back to a friend, Mark Oken, who I guess he had worked for Hugh when he was at Bank of America and later became CFO of the bank. And he recognized after Hugh retired from Bank of America that this was important to him. he really got a group of Hughes kind of leadership team, retired executives, and they raised a significant amount of capital to really get the McColl-Lockwood lab launched and off the ground. He got Chuck Cooley involved and Ken Lewis and some other people that really helped move the needle. And we wouldn't be where we are today without their generosity.
Luther, thank you for that. This is a great story of commitment and dedication, and thank you for everything you're doing for your daughter and for thousands of others, people who suffer from this disease. Is there something that if listeners were interested in following up and understanding either more about the disease or the efforts of your research team, where should they go to find out more?
Yeah, I think if they just Googled McColl-Lockwood Lab for Muscular Dystrophy Research, they can learn more about the research that we're conducting in Charlotte. And McColl is MCCOLL. And then the website for our business is mlbiosolutions.com. And the scientific research that is updated from time to time is posted there. And that website is managed by Bridge Bio.
Well, I hope people are going to be looking back on this as one of the great crazy good turns, as you help a lot of people with really tough disease. And so thank you both. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Luther.
Yeah, thank you to both of you.
I hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Luther, Jane, and Larry. And I'd like to say a special thank you to Larry for bringing us such a great and inspiring story. And I'd like to offer you, our listeners, the opportunity to share a story of your own. If you know of someone who's doing great things for somebody else, tell us by sending an email about it to hello@crazygoodturns.org. That's hello@crazygoodturns.org. Our team reads every message we receive, and we'd love to hear from you. Who knows? Maybe your story will end up in a future episode. We appreciate your listening. If you like what you've heard, please share Crazy Good Turns with your friends. Also, please support our show by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting platform of your choice. And connect with us on the social network of your choice. You'll find us at Crazy Good Turns, all one word. As always, I want to thank the team that makes Crazy Good Turns possible. Our producers, Brian Sabin and Megan Hanlon, editing and mixing by Score, and Leslie Nunn for keeping this operation going forward. Lastly, I want to express my gratitude to you, our listeners, for taking part in a community that celebrates people who do good things for others. Your giving of your time to listen to these interviews and acknowledge these good deeds is a crazy good turn of its own. Thank you for your help. We hope to see you again soon in our next episode when we celebrate another crazy good turn.